The moon is three-quarters full, perfect bombing weather. They're part of a stream of 40 aircraft, staggered across the night sky, each loaded with to 50-kilogram high-explosive bombs and incendiaries. The factory won't rubber eyepiece. Richter feels sweat on his palms despite the cold. Missing a target means bringing the bombs home or dumping them. Randomly neither option. Appealing to a pilot who's flown 37 missions over Britain. What do you mean? Not seeing it? There are structures, but they don't match the reconnaissance images. I'm seeing fields, trees, small agricultural buildings. Maybe not a factory complex. Weber moves forward from his navigation station, peering down. That's the correct grid reference. I'm certain. Richter throttles back slightly. Circling, the Heinkel's engines drone steadily. Around them, other aircraft in the bombing stream continue past, heading for alternate targets deeper into the English Midlands. Time is bleeding away. Fuel is finite. There, Weber points. See that cluster of buildings? The spacing is too regular for farms. Richter sees it now. Rectangular shadows that might be rooftops. But they're partially obscured by what appears to be tree cover, and the expected glow of industrial activity, the telltale light leaking from factory windows, the sparks from metalworking, the heat signatures that make factories visible even in blackout conditions is completely absent. Could they have shut down production? Kruger suggests. Impossible, Richter replies. Britain needs those aircraft parts. They're working around the clock. He'd read the intelligence reports himself. 3 shifts, 24-hour operation, critical war production. But the evidence of his own eyes contradicts everything he's been told. Herr Oberleutnant, decision. Weber's voice carries the weight of protocol. Something that was hidden right beneath him. Something that shouldn't have been possible to hide. Below, in the carefully camouflaged factory that Klaus Richter couldn't see, 1,200 workers continue their shift. Welding torches spark behind blacked-out windows. The Sturwan, hydraulic presses, thunder, and overhead, painted on the rooftops and stretched across steel framework. An elaborate false landscape of canvas and timber and chicken. Wire makes the massive Austin Motor Company shadow. Factory, all 300,000 square feet of it disappear into the English countryside like a magic trick performed on an industrial scale. This is the story of how ordinary people made a factory vanish, how painters became warriors, how theatrical set designers became strategic military assets, how the simple tools of illusion paint, netting, and audacity became as important to Britain's survival as radar, Spitfires, and the courage of pilots. It begins not with grand strategy or military planning, but with a simple, terrifying question that emerged in the summer of 1940 as Nazi bombers darkened the skies over Britain. How do you hide something that cannot be moved? June 1940, Leamington, Spa, Warwickshire. Colonel John Turner stands in the middle of an empty field, squinting against the afternoon sun. Around him, construction crews swarm like ants across what will become one of Britain's most crucial industrial sites. The ground trembles with the movement of earth-moving equipment. Steel girders rise in skeletal rows. This field formerly used for grazing cattle is being transformed into a shadow factory, a top-secret facility that will manufacture Sterling bomber fuselages and Bristol Hercules engines. The timeline is impossibly tight, operational in 9 months. But Turner isn't watching the construction, he's looking up. They'll see it from 20,000 feet, he says to the man beside him, a thin, bespectacled civilian in a rumpled suit who looks more like a schoolteacher than someone whose opinion matters to military planners. The civilian is Oliver Messel, one of Britain's most celebrated theatrical set designers. Before the war, his elaborate stage productions dazzled London's West End. Now, his theatrical eye sees something different in this construction, site vulnerability. Worse than that, Colonel Messel replies, pulling a reconnaissance photograph from his leather satchel. They'll photograph it during construction, plot its location, and return when it's operational. You're not just building a factory, you're building a target. Turner has seen the Luftwaffe's handiwork firsthand. 2 weeks ago, he toured the Supermarine factory in Southampton after a bombing raid. The production halls were cratered ruins, machinery twisted into abstract metal sculptures. 12 workers dead. 3 months of Spitfire production destroyed in a single night. The Shadow Factory program exists precisely because Britain's existing industrial infrastructure is too concentrated, too vulnerable. But dispersing production means nothing if the new facilities can be spotted from the air and obliterated before they produce a single aircraft component. The Air Ministry wants options, Turner says. Can it be done? Can we hide this? Messel walks across the churned earth, his city shoes sinking into mud. He's already worked on camouflaging coastal installations and military depots. But a factory of this scale eventually covering 12 acres presents challenges that make theatrical set design look simple. In theatre, Colonel, we create illusion for an audience seated in fixed positions. We control the lighting. We know exactly where they're looking. He gestures at the sky. Your audience here can approach from any angle, at any altitude, in any light condition. And they're trying very hard to see through our tricks. That's not an answer. Mr. Messel. No, but here's what is possible. Messel unfolds a second photograph. This one showing English countryside from altitude. The Luftwaffe navigates primarily by visual reference rivers, roads, railway lines, distinctive buildings. Their pilots are trained to recognize industrial patterns, the regular spacing of factory buildings, the geometric precision of loading docks, the straight lines of rail sidings. But the human eye at altitude has limitations. It averages. It simplifies. It expects certain patterns. He points to a cluster of buildings in the photograph. What do you see here? Turner studies the image. Farm buildings. A barn, perhaps. Some outbuildings. Look closer at the spacing. The size. Those are actually military storage depots. But we've painted them to break up their regular shapes. Added false shadows to create the illusion of smaller structures. Extended hedgerows with netting and canvas to disguise access roads. The German reconnaissance flights photographed them 3 times and classified them as agricultural. For the first time since arriving at the site, Turner feels something approaching hope. You're proposing we disguise the factory as farmland, not just farmland, an entire landscape. We'll need to understand the surrounding terrain, first study it from the air the way the Germans will. Then we create a false topography that matches expectations. The factory buildings become barns and rural structures. The vast roof surfaces are broken up with paint schemes that suggest smaller buildings, hedgerows, even fields. From altitude the human brain will see what it expects to see. English countryside. A foreman approaches, hard hat in hand, waiting for decisions about foundation depths and steel specifications. The noise of construction surrounds them, hammering, welding, the grind of concrete mixers. All of it advertising the site's existence to anyone flying overhead. How long before you can begin? Turner asks. I'll need a team. Painters, obviously, but also landscapers, carpenters, engineers who understand structural camouflage. And access to aerial photographs, the more recent, the better. We need to see what the Luftwaffe sees. Turner makes a decision. You'll have it. All of it. The Air Ministry will provide whatever resources you need. Because if we can't hide these factories, we might as well not build them. Backdrops for West End musicals now calculate how shadows fall on industrial rooftops. Sculptors who worked in bronze and marble now shape chicken wire and canvas into false hedgerows. Set designers who created fairy tale castles now design fake farm buildings that must fool enemy pilots. They work from aerial photographs, studying how real English villages and farmland appear from altitude. They note how shadows pool in certain ways, how roads curve naturally rather than running in industrial straight lines, how fields have irregular boundaries and how actual farm buildings cluster in organic patterns, not geometric grids. The first test comes in August, when an RAF reconnaissance Spitfire photographs the partially completed factory site. The images are rushed to Messel's temporary headquarters in a requisitioned hotel in Leamington Spa. He spreads them across a large table, and his team gathers around with magnifying glasses. There, says Margaret Clark, a former art teacher who's become invaluable for her understanding of colour and light. She points to a section where the factory's regular roofline is starkly visible, to straight, too obviously industrial. And here, adds David Robson, a theatre carpenter, the shadows are wrong. Real buildings would cast different patterns at this time of day. Messel makes notes, his mind already working through solutions. Paint schemes to break up straight lines. False structures to disguise uniform rooftops. Netting draped at specific angles to create convincing shadow patterns. We have 3 months before this facility goes operational, he tells his team. 3 months to make 12 acres of factory disappear. The workers inside will produce aircraft components that might change the course of the war. But none of that matters if the Luftwaffe finds them. He looks at the photographs again, seeing not what exists, but what must be created an illusion so complete that enemy pilots will fly overhead without seeing the target directly beneath them. Gentlemen, ladies, Messel says quietly, we're going to need a great deal of paint. September 1940, the Austin Motor Company Shadow Factory, Cofton Hackett. The first brushstroke feels absurdly inadequate. Sarah Weston stands on a wooden scaffolding platform 40 feet above the ground, her paintbrush loaded with dull green pigment, staring at the vast expanse of corrugated steel roofing that stretches before her. The factory roof covers nearly 4 acres, 174,240 square feet of highly reflective metal that, from the air, would shine like a mirror signalling enemy bombers. Her job, along with 43 other painters recruited from art schools, theatres, and even a biscuit factory that closed when war broke out, is to make it disappear. Don't think about the whole roof, says Jack Morrison, the crew foreman who once painted sets for the Birmingham Repertory Theatre. He's 56, too old for military service, but possessing skills that have suddenly become militarily critical. Think about your section, just your section. Sarah's section is a rectangle roughly 20 feet by 30 feet, still enormous, but manageable if she doesn't look at the surrounding acres awaiting treatment. She dips her brush again and applies paint in the specific pattern Messel's team has calculated. Not uniform coverage, but irregular patches and streaks designed to break up the roof's visual continuity. From ground level, it looks chaotic, almost random, but from altitude according to the scale models and mathematical calculations it will read as something else entirely. What are we making this look like? Asks Tommy Briggs, a 19-year-old apprentice painter working the adjacent section. His hands are already stained green despite the early hour. Hedgerow, Morrison replies, consulting a colour-coded diagram that maps the entire roof like a military battle plan. Your section and Sarah's are part of a false hedgerow running northeast to southwest. Matches the actual hedgerow pattern in the surrounding countryside. From 20,000 feet, it needs to look like trees and vegetation, not a factory roof. Below them, inside the factory, the sounds of war production echo upward. Lathes turning, presses stamping. The building is already operational, producing fuselage components for Halifax bombers even as the camouflage crews work to hide it. Time is a luxury Britain doesn't have. Production can't wait for camouflage completion, which means the painters work in shifts, around the clock, racing against the next bomber moon, those periods when lunar light makes nighttime bombing raids possible. Aircraft approaching. The shout comes from a spotter positioned on the roof's highest point. Everyone freezes. Paintbrushes hover. Conversations stop. Sarah's heart hammers as she scans the sky. They're a glint of metal catching afternoon's sun, but the shape resolves into something familiar. The twin engines and greenhouse nose of an RAF Wellington bomber, likely returning from a training flight or coastal patrol. Friendly. The spotter calls out, "Resume work." The tension breaks, but slowly. Every aircraft sound triggers the same response now. The Luftwaffe has been pounding British cities and industrial targets since July. Bristol, Birmingham, Liverpool all have burned under German bombs. The shadow factories remain secret, their locations classified, but secrets have a way of leaking. A careless conversation in a pub, a document left on a train, or simply persistent German reconnaissance flights piecing together intelligence from hundreds of photographs. Morrison moves along the scaffolding, inspecting work, offering corrections. "Tommy, you're applying too much paint. It needs texture, not solid coverage. See how Sarah's doing it? Irregular, patchy. Real vegetation isn't uniform. The technique is counterintuitive. Every instinct from civilian life says to apply paint evenly, to achieve consistent coverage. But camouflage demands the opposite, controlled chaos that mimics natural disorder. By noon, Sarah's arms ache from reaching and stretching. Her knees hurt from kneeling on wooden planks. Paint spatters cover her overalls and has somehow gotten into her hair despite the kerchief tied around her head. She descends for lunch break, joining other workers in a canteen tent erected beside the factory. The conversation buzzes with rumours and speculation. "I heard they got the Vickers factory in Weybridge last week," says an older woman named Dorothy, who paints with mathematical precision after spending 20 years decorating fine china. Killed 18 workers. The Wellington factory, someone else confirms. But production continued. They had it back running within days. This is the paradox of shadow factories. They exist because Britain's concentrated industrial infrastructure is vulnerable. But dispersing production means creating new targets. The only solution is to make those targets invisible, or at least invisible enough that German pilots can't distinguish them from the surrounding countryside. After lunch, Sarah returns to the roof, but now she's assigned to a different task, alongside a team of carpenters and riggers. She helps install what Messel's designers call garnishing, three-dimensional camouflage elements that add depth to the illusion. They stretch camouflage netting across sections of roof, anchoring it to steel frames bolted into the factory structure. The netting itself is woven from hemp and jute, already treated with fire retardant and dyed in irregular patterns of green and brown. Into this netting, they weave strips of dyed fabric, chicken wire shaped to suggest foliage, and even real branches cut from nearby woods. It's like decorating a Christmas tree, Tommy jokes, threading a fabric strip through the netting. Except the goal is to make it look like there's no tree at all. The work is painstaking. Each section of netting must be positioned at specific angles to cast shadows that reinforce the false landscape painted on the roof below. Too flat, and it reads as artificial. Too elevated, and it creates suspicious gaps that might catch a pilot's eye. The correct height calculated through scale models and photographic tests is roughly 18 inches above the roof surface. By mid-afternoon, members of Messel's design team arrive to inspect progress. They carry aerial photographs taken that morning by an RAF reconnaissance plane flying at 22,000 feet, the typical altitude of German bombers. The photographs are rushed to a makeshift darkroom in a converted office trailer. Within our prints are distributed to crew leaders. Sarah watches Morrison study the images with a magnifying glass, his expression unreadable. "Well?" she asks. Morrison looks up, and for the first time since she met him 3 weeks ago, he's smiling. "Look for yourself." She takes the photograph. The image shows countryside fields, hedgerows, scattered farm buildings. She studies it for nearly a minute before Morrison points to a specific area. "That's US. That's the factory." Sarah stares. Now that he's identified it, she can see certain regularities in the shapes, a subtle geometric precision that natural landscape wouldn't possess. But you'd have to know what you were looking for. A German pilot flying at altitude, navigating by landmarks and searching for obvious industrial targets, would almost certainly miss it. Almost isn't good enough, though. Morrison's smile fades as he points to another section. "Here, see this? Too much reflection." The paint hasn't fully dried, and wet paint shows up brighter in photographs. "We need to accelerate drying time, perhaps add a matte finish coat." The work continues. Days blend into weeks. The painters develop calluses on their hands and permanent paint stains under their fingernails. They learn to work in rain, in wind, in the early frost of approaching autumn. They paint through air raid sirens when German bombers pass overhead heading for Birmingham or Coventry. Never quite sure if they've been spotted, if tonight their factory will appear on a Luftwaffe targeting list. In October, a German reconnaissance Dornier flies directly over the facility at 28,000 feet. The RAF doesn't intercept it either. The radar stations missed it, or it flew too high for available fighters. Workers scramble into shelters, certain they've been photographed, certain that bomber formations will follow within days. But days pass, then weeks. No raid comes. In early November, British intelligence intercepts a Luftwaffe planning document. The intercept is fragmentary, decoded from encrypted radio transmissions, but it includes a list of potential targets in the Midlands. The Austin Shadow Factory isn't on it. Colonel Turner visits the site to deliver the news personally. He finds Messel on the roof, supervising the installation of additional garnishing along the factory's western edge. The Luftwaffe doesn't know we're here, Turner says, his voice carrying something close to wonder. They've photographed this area at least 4 times. They know the Austin Motor Company has been dispersing production, but they can't find us. Messel doesn't celebrate. He's too aware of how fragile the illusion remains. They'll keep looking, he says. We need to maintain the camouflage, adapt it as seasons change. What works in autumn won't necessarily work in winter when trees are bare and fields are different colours. You'll have whatever resources you need, Turner assures him. What you've accomplished here, making an entire factory invisible, it's being studied by the War Office. They want to replicate it at every shadow factory, every critical installation in Britain. Below them, inside the disguised factory, machines continue their steady work. 3 shifts of workers producing bomber components that will eventually find their way into aircraft striking back at Germany. The factory runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And above it all, painted canvas and strategically placed netting maintain an illusion that has become as crucial to Britain's war effort as the production itself. Sarah Weston wipes paint from her hands and looks out across the camouflaged roof across what has become her battlefield. No uniform, no rifle, just paintbrushes and scaffolding and the strange, critical work of making things disappear. Back to work then, Morrison calls out. Section 7 needs touching up and the lights fading. We've got maybe 2 hours before we lose the sun. They climb back onto the scaffolding. Paint brushes dip into buckets. And the careful, patient work of invisibility continues. Intelligence reports a shadow factory complex somewhere in this grid, his navigator announces. Frustration evident even through the intercom static. Production facility for bomber components. High priority target. Richter studies the landscape below through breaks in the winter clouds. England looks different from the air in January, fields brown and grey, trees bare, everything rendered in muted tones. It should make industrial structures more visible, not less. Yet he sees only countryside, scattered farms, village clusters, the occasional manor house. Nothing that resembles a factory. We're searching in the correct area, he asks, though he knows his navigator doesn't make such errors. Positive. The coordinates match intelligence, reports exactly. There should be a manufacturing complex covering approximately 8 acres. Rail access. Supporting infrastructure. Then where is it? The navigator has no answer. Neither does Richter, who has flown reconnaissance missions over Britain for 2 years now and has learned to trust his eyes. But his eyes keep lying to him. Lately, factories that intelligence insists exist simply aren't visible. Or worse, they appear as something else entirely. 3 weeks ago, he photographed what he believed was a munitions facility near Bristol, only to have the images analysed and classified as agricultural structures. Low priority. Yet wireless intercepts suggested significant production activity in exactly that location. Either British intelligence is fabricating radio traffic to confuse German analysts, or something else is happening, something he doesn't fully understand. Mark it as inconclusive, Richter finally says. We'll photograph the entire grid and let intelligence sort it out. Below, inside what Richter cannot see, the factory that doesn't exist continues its work. The same day, inside the camouflaged facility, Arthur Pemberton has worked at the Shadow Factory for 18 months. He operates a hydraulic press that stamps aluminum components for Halifax bomber fuselages. 8-hour shifts that blur into routine. Load the aluminum sheet, position it precisely, engage the press, remove the formed component, inspect for defects, repeat. He's 42 years old, rejected from military service due to flat feet and partial deafness in his left ear from a childhood illness. The rejection still stings, but this work matters. Every component he produces goes into aircraft that carry the war back to Germany. Today, during his lunch break, he climbs to the factory roof. Not all workers are allowed up here. Security concerns about loose lips and careless talk, but Arthur helped with the initial camouflage painting and occasionally assists with maintenance. The roof has become a strange landscape unto itself, a theatrical set piece that transforms the industrial reality below into something else entirely. He walks across what appears, from above, to be a hedgerow. Up close, it's painted metal and suspended netting, but the illusion is remarkable. Sarah Weston and her team are touching up paint near the eastern edge, preparing for the spring months ahead when the surrounding countryside will green up and the camouflage must match. How's it holding up? Arthur asks, approaching Sarah, whom he's come to know through these rooftop encounters. Better than expected, she replies, wiping paint from her brush. We've had to repaint some sections where weather damaged the finish, but the overall scheme is intact. Jerry flew over yesterday, did you hear? I heard. Reconnaissance plane. High altitude. Straight over us. Didn't deviate. Didn't circle. Just continued north. Either he didn't see us, or he saw us and thought we were something else. She gestures at the surrounding camouflage, which means this is working. Arthur looks out across the roof, trying to imagine how it appears from 20,000 feet. From here, standing on it, the deception seems obvious, paint and netting and theatrical tricks. But altitude changes perception. Distance simplifies. The human mind fills in details based on expectation rather than reality. My brother's a pilot, Arthur says quietly. RAF, flies Lancasters. He writes about flying over German industrial targets, the Ruhr, the factories around Hamburg. Says they light up at night from production activity. Makes them easy to find, easy to bomb. We're completely blacked out here, Sarah notes. Not a single light visible from outside. Everything sealed, every window covered. The workers joke about it producing bombers in the dark, like moles digging tunnels. But we're not in the dark. We're just invisible. Arthur pauses, considering the strange logic of their situation. The Germans know Britain is producing aircraft somewhere. They know the major factories were dispersed after the early bombing raids. But they can't find the new facilities because people like you painted them into the landscape. People like us. Sarah corrects. You help too. Everyone here contributes to the illusion. An air raid siren wails in the distance. Birmingham, probably, or Coventry again. The sound carries across the winter countryside, a reminder that other places, less effectively hidden, continue to burn. The shadow factories exist because the original manufacturing centres proved vulnerable. Supermarine, bombed. Vickers, bombed. The de Havilland factory at Hatfield, struck twice in 1940. Production dispersed into smaller facilities scattered across the countryside, hidden in plain sight through camouflage techniques that would have seemed like fantasy before the war. Do you ever think about what happens if they figure it out? Arthur asks. Do you ever think about what happens if they figure it out? Arthur asks. If some German analyst notices the inconsistencies in their photographs, or if a pilot gets lucky and recognizes what he's seeing. Sarah doesn't answer immediately. She's considered this question many times during long hours on the scaffolding, paintbrush in hand, racing against time and Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights. Then we paint it again, she finally says. Arthur heads for the roof access door, back to his press and the endless stream of aluminum components. Sarah remains behind, studying the paint scheme with a critical eye, already noting sections that will need touching up next week. March 1942, Berlin, Luftwaffe Intelligence Headquarters. Major Friedrich Wolf spreads reconnaissance photographs across his desk, hundreds of images taken over Britain during the past 6 months. His job is pattern recognition, identifying industrial facilities from aerial photography. Before the war, he taught geography at the University of Heidelberg. Now he hunts factories, and he's beginning to suspect he's being deceived. Here, he says to his assistant, pointing to a photograph of countryside near Birmingham. This area, something is wrong with it. The assistant, a young lieutenant named Kruger, studies the image. I see farmland. Some buildings, but they appear agricultural. Look at the spacing, the relationship between structures. It's too regular. Wolf pulls out older photographs of the same area, taken before the war. The buildings are new. They weren't here in 1938, yet they're styled to look like traditional farm structures. Perhaps they are farms. Increased agricultural production for the war effort. Wolf shakes his head. The British don't have the resources to build new farms. They're converting every possible acre of parkland and estate gardens to food production, but they're not constructing new agricultural buildings. These are something else. He pulls out more photographs, dozens of sites across the English Midlands where similar anomalies appear. New structures styled to look old. Regularly spaced buildings disguised as irregular farmsteads. Areas where the landscape seems slightly wrong in ways he can't quite articulate but can sense. They're hiding factories, Wolf says with certainty, camouflaging them to blend with the surrounding countryside. It's brilliant, actually. We're looking for industrial structures, regular roof lines, rail connections, the visual signatures of manufacturing. But if those signatures are disguised, ... how would we find them? That's the question. Wolf studies the photographs again, searching for tells, for mistakes in the British deception. Camouflage has to be maintained. It has to adapt to seasonal changes. And it's never perfect. There are always inconsistencies, if you know what to look for. But finding those inconsistencies requires time and careful analysis. Resources stretched thin across multiple fronts. The Eastern Front consumes vast quantities of German military attention. North Africa, the Atlantic, Britain, still undefeated despite 2 years of bombing, becomes a secondary concern. The shadow factories continue their work, hidden beneath paint and netting and theatrical illusion. Production numbers climb. Halifax bombers, Lancaster bombers, components flowing from dispersed facilities that the Luftwaffe knows must exist, but cannot definitively locate. June 1943, the camouflaged factory, now operating at full capacity. Sarah Weston stands on the factory roof in summer sunlight, supervising a crew repainting sections to match the greener landscape. 20 months of this work have given her an intimate understanding of light, shadow, and perception. She can judge distance and altitude by eye now, can calculate how colours will read from 20,000 feet, can spot the tells that might reveal the deception to enemy observers. The factory has never been bombed, not once. German raiders have passed overhead dozens of times, heading for Birmingham or Coventry or Liverpool. Reconnaissance aircraft have photographed the area repeatedly, but no bombs have fallen here, no incendiaries have rained down. No high explosive destruction has torn through the production halls. The camouflage works. It works because of careful planning and constant maintenance. It works because ordinary people, painters and carpenters and theatre designers learned to think like enemy pilots and created deceptions that exploit the limitations of human perception. It works because Britain, pushed to the edge of defeat, discovered that survival sometimes depends not on military might but on ingenuity and patience, and the willingness to paint things that aren't there. Colonel Turner visits occasionally, always impressed by the camouflage's effectiveness. He brings stories of other facilities similarly disguised, an aircraft assembly plant near Bristol that appears to be a country estate, a munitions factory in Wales hidden beneath false topography, an engine works in the Midlands that disappears into a painted landscape of fields and hedgerows. The War Office estimates the camouflage program has prevented dozens of successful bombing raids. Turner tells Sarah during his latest visit, perhaps hundreds. The factories remain operational because the enemy can't find them. Production continues uninterrupted. And that production, the aircraft, the components, the munitions, is turning the tide. Sarah doesn't think in those grand strategic terms. She thinks about paintbrushes and scaffolding, about the precise shade of green needed to match summer grass as seen from altitude, about maintaining an illusion that has become second nature after 2 years of constant work. It's just paint, she says. It's never just paint, Turner replies. It's camouflage. It's survival. It's the difference between a factory that produces bombers and a crater in the ground. He's right, of course. Sarah knows this. Every worker in the factory knows it. They're all part of a strange conspiracy of invisibility, hiding in plain sight, producing weapons of war, beneath a disguise so effective that the enemy flies overhead and sees nothing but English countryside. The irony doesn't escape her. They're helping to build bombers that will strike German factories which, presumably, someone in Germany is trying to camouflage just as effectively. Invisibility versus invisibility. Deception versus counter-deception. War reduced to paint and netting and theatrical tricks. But those tricks work. The factory stands. The workers survive. And somewhere over Germany, the bombers they helped build carry the war home to the enemy. Sarah picks up her paintbrush and returns to work. There's always more to paint, always maintenance to perform. Always the possibility that today's reconnaissance flight will finally see through the deception. But until that day comes, if IT ever does, the factory will remain what it has become, a ghost, present but unseen, hidden in plain sight by nothing more elaborate than human cleverness and a great deal of paint.